all the way back in early 2018, the indie platformer Celeste sort of came out of nowhere. First impressions were generally that of it being nothing more than the next in line of a million difficult indie platform games, like Super Meat Boy, The End Is Nigh, VVVVVVV Love, You Have to Win the Game, 1001 Spikes, Spelunky, Cave Story. These are a dime a dozen, so it's no wonder the game initially flew under most people's radar, both pre and post release. But that precondition of near suspicion towards the game is also a strong indicator for the authenticity of its praise. Because Celeste isn't necessarily the most unique or original game out there. It evidently harkens from a long line of predecessors, using tropes bordering on cliches, and generally wearing its influences proudly on its sleeves. For perspective, when Celeste does a Mario reference, it's through the intently obscure white block crouch, in opposition to how, say, Braid, a decade prior, could play with the concept of castles and princesses with complete sincerity, without being seen as tired or even a parody of said references. The paraphrase landscape was shifted so drastically since then that whatever real estate Braid had feels alien and distant today, and this applies full scale on the true achievements of Celeste as a whole. Saying Celeste is just a really neat package of complete parts is underselling it though. It's more like a profound miracle. And the glue that unifies and contextualizes every little part of the game into an intricate, coherent whole is the thematic commitment. Celeste is hard because it's a game about struggle and conquest. It's about overcoming the challenge and reaching your goals. But equally, it's a game about humanity and weakness. It understands how toughness and fragility are deeply interconnected and makes no judgment based on this. As such, Celeste is a difficult game that features an assist mode that lets the player ease and adjust the experience to their own liking, as a way of saying it's always okay to ask for a helping hand. Of course, you may argue that on some level, most hard games are inherently about the struggle of the player, and any assistance given will also be connected to that theme as a contrast. And you wouldn't be wrong. In fact, with the teachings of Celeste as your lens, you could probably make such a reading on a lot of games. But again, that's more to the strength of Celeste for actually presenting this very philosophy in a game landscape that easily chastises players for not playing on ultra hard. With that said, none of this is necessarily explicit within the actual text of the game. Rather, it's more a sensible conclusion based on how strongly emphasized these themes are. Not just within the narrative of the game, but through the core mechanics and level design. The fact of the matter is that in between all the blatant parts, Celeste is mired so thoroughly in its themes that you would be excused for having missed the woods for the trees. It's the kind of experience that allows you to find some new revelation with every revisit. Celeste is such a ridiculously rich game that just begs to be unpacked, analyzed and read to the furthest extent, so we may find even more meaning and wisdom in its dense thematic through line. So, let's not beat around the bush. Finish that strawberry pie, get your mountain gear, and pack your bags, because we're going to Canada. Celeste is perhaps one of the most clear-cut examples of video games as allegory. The conquest of the mountain is a physically arduous task, both in idea and virtual proxy. And as such, it's an easily understandable concept adapted in everyday speech for laborious undertakings. The idea of climbing the mountain as a metaphor in media is probably as common as being lost at sea, the eye of the storm, in tune with nature, or the general romantic conquest of the wilderness. It's a classic, near timeless trope that's both culturally universal and mechanically adequate for a platforming game. Because of this, we don't just suspect Celeste Mountain to be a metaphor, it's basically the foundational requirement for the game's narrative to work. The titular mountain in Celeste is both the physical and metaphysical setting for everything that happens within the story. Our vessel is Madeline, a young woman troubled with mental health and social issues, who sets out to climb Celeste Mountain, located in the fictional country Canada. She controls as your usual platform game character, jumps around, climbs walls, flies through the air, and changes hair color. Your immediate goal is to simply reach the mountain top. But it's evident that the idea of her just being some girl who suddenly gets into hiking as a hobby is secondary to the thematic tension in her internal conflict that you as a player get to explore. When Madeline says to the other characters that she wanted to climb the mountain to prove to herself that she could do it, it's painfully obvious how little basis the narrative even has to some diegetic objective reality within the fiction. Madeline is not really here to climb a mountain, not in the literal sense. Rather, she's on an introspective journey to challenge her inner demons and pursue self-fulfillment. As a protagonist for the allegorical journey, she's intently broken and weary in several different ways that at face value may paint her as a remarkably tragic character, but might be better interpreted as anchor points for the audience to connect and self-identify with. Her main symptoms mentioned in passing are anxiety, panic attacks, and general depression. But we may also find traces of social and behavioral aspects, like alcohol abuse, anger management, a strained relationship with an ex-partner, being an outsider to her contemporary youth culture, plus the initial hints and later confirmation of her also being trans. And while this exact kitchen sink combination is far from unrealistic, it's clear that they are mostly colorful flares to partly paint Madeline as a complicated character, but primarily serve as a set of relatable bullet points for players to identify with. Be it mental health issues, alienation, self-loathing, addiction, regret, or sorrow, there's a high likelihood that players will latch onto the one thing that works for them. To confirm that, yes, I feel this too. I am just like Madeline. In fact, if the player wants to, there is an often overlooked feature that lets them rename Madeline to whatever they want, furthering that connection of the character as a stand-in for the player. It is with this framework that we have to understand the remaining cast. Yes, they are characters with lives and personalities too, but they primarily exist in relation to Madeline as the player vessel. And as such, them as portraits and their motivations are and should be vague by design. Theo may be some cool Instapix hipster dude, but his main narrative function is to be a friend. Granny likewise comes to function as a mentor and stand-in for a familial bond. And Oshiro? Put a pin in that one. To none other is this point as vital as Madeline's dark reflection, referred to in-game as a part of her, but more colloquially known as Madeline. Early on, this character is introduced as a consequence of the magical properties of Celeste Mountain and how it shows people their true selves. In this case,
Shadow the Madeline, the ultimate life form constructed 50 years ago by Professor Gerald Robotnik on the space colony Ark.
She's some sort of general dark reflection of Madeline. What exactly is actually left a bit vague by the internal text, and this is why it's so important to understand Madeline as a narrative vessel rather than as a de facto stand-in for one set idea. Because she's the dark side of Madeline, whatever personal demons you projected upon her is what Madeline is meant to truly represent. Perhaps in a literal context, she's the voice of doubt in the back of your head, brought to flesh, or meant to equally be all of Madeline's portrayed problems at the same time. But trying to diagnose Madeline and pin down exactly what mental health issue Madeline officially represents misses the point. Whatever specificity your conclusion takes, it's obvious that your takeaway of Madeline should just be that of the metaphysical incarnation of Madeline's internal struggle. Or quite literally, fighting yourself. As such, she's easily portrayed as the antagonist, what with her basically being the substitute villain for the game to present some stakes, but ultimately this just doesn't hold up, either as a reading or through the actual game. Because while Madeline may be Madeline's mountain, Madeline is also just Madeline. She's lovable and arguably the most memorable and funny part of the game, but from a narrative perspective, Madeline's main purpose is simply to contextualize Madeline being her own worst enemy in an easily and digestible magical way. With all of that established, Celeste, as an allegory, revolves around Madeline overcoming her own personal issues as a direct parallel to her also climbing a mountain. The layout of the mountain allows each chapter to not just be a platforming set piece, but also a thematic key sequence. Once again, the actual portrayed events interpreted as a standard mountain climb are so detached to what's actually happening within the game on a narrative level that such a reading will simply get lost when put under any scrutiny. Half of the levels are magical detours that stall the physical climbing, but contribute to the most thematic cohesion to what's actually happening in the story. This is evident in how the entire game is conveniently retraced in swift succession during the final level, because at that point the conflict has been resolved and only the actual climb remains. So no, Theo probably doesn't do the dash jump, simply because he doesn't take the needlessly hard route like Madeline does. You're not meant to think he can literally fly off screen. Don't be silly. Stop it. This is not to say that the diverse locales of Celeste Mountain aren't important or don't contribute anything to the story. Quite the opposite. A huge part of the strength of Celeste is precisely this harmony of literal and figurative narratives, and why it absolutely works as an allegory. We need the physical mountain to contextualize the internal one, even though not all steps of the journey are uphill. Bookended by a brief prologue and epilogue, the central story of Celeste takes place over 7 integral chapters that collectively tell the tale of Madeline reaching the peak of the mountain, but individually explore every single angle of the emotional struggles that necessitates the need for overcoming the mountain in both senses of the word. Very conveniently, these chapters are sequenced in perfect symmetrical balance that gives room for more straightforward levels to pace out the more complex ones. Chapter 1 and 7 are mostly focused on the climb, with Chapter 4 functioning as a divider in the middle. Of course, all these levels are complete and important to the themes of the story, but it's safe to say they don't really revolve around the core conflict to the extent that levels 2, 3, 5, and 6 do. They're the setup, escalation, climax, and resolution, with the surrounding 3 levels being your double-decker hamburger buns. So following one of the most concise, satisfying tutorials in the medium, the game opens up with the first chapter, Forsaken City. establishing the core mechanics within an abandoned city environment with fun catapults to shoot off from. And while it may be the least eventful chapter of the story, that's more for setup and exposition. We are introduced to Madeline through her conviction more than anything else. This is it. You can do this. The city is intently lonely and desolate to resonate a thematic backdrop for Madeline's introduction, as she feels much the same. And whatever else there is to know will be revealed in due time, when the story necessitates it. We are simultaneously introduced to Granny, who initially comes off as a bit brash and cynical of Madeline's ambitions, before further development reveals her to ultimately be kind and caring. She's so used to travelers attempting and failing to scale the mountain that this has simply become routine for her. After all, if Madeline was almost killed by Granny's driveway, perhaps the mountain is too much for her. This whole idea of being that one in a million who defies the odds and actually makes it all the way seems to be the subtextual theme of this chapter, with the abandoned city at perhaps surface level being a signifier of vague anti-capitalist themes. It gains way more substance on the metaphysical level, as the symbolic ghost town of all the people who tried and failed, who came to Celeste Mountain, just like Madeline. Everyone out there who really wanted to accomplish the goal, but fell short. With empty buildings housing the idea of these people as the absent population of a city, it's befitting that we conclude on a monument that reads,
"This memorial dedicated to those who perished on the climb."
Reaching this milestone is proof that Madeline could make it past the point where most got stuck, as a dent in the statistic. There's still a long, treacherous climb left, but for now, you made it. Although there's no self-congratulating, only defeat and the ever-present doubt. A realization of the difficulties, that maybe this was not a good idea after all. This one line surprisingly carries tremendous weight, not exactly in what's being said, but how this is being delivered. Throughout the game, characters will all speak to each other facing one or the other side of the screen. This is a rudimentary 101 way of establishing direction for dialogue, and in all other cases, this is simply good form, and completely non-important in how unremarkably functional it is. So why then is this the only part of the entire game that features a front-facing Madeline, berating herself nonetheless? Admittedly, this is a vague enough little aspect that you might come to some completely different conclusion, but it's very tempting to see it as Madeline showing her two faces at once, foreshadowing the impending introduction of Madeline by basically having her talk through Madeline, but more importantly, establishing a suggestion that perhaps all scenes involving Madeline, in some sense, is just this. Obviously not as some TV tropes fan theory about Madeline hallucinating everything, but rather as something the audience may recognize from real life. I mean, we don't have edgy, evil copies of ourselves causing havoc. Well, most of us don't. Rather, this is something abstract that comes from within. It is a part of ourselves, equally as much as the rest. Or maybe she's just looking up at the bird sitting on her head. But whatever. Following this setup of the mountain, Madeline, and her resolve, Chapter 2 introduces the recurring theme of duality through mirrors and reflection within Celeste's narrative. The level is set within a dream world reflection of the internal reality, which restores and opens up a decrepit old fortress for Madeline to explore. And after discovering a magic mirror, Madeline is properly introduced as the living reflection of Madeline. This idea of parallel worlds and the mirror image is echoed in the level design, where both the awake and dreaming incarnations of the old site are strikingly similar, yet still different. Or how Madeline is established as a shadow version of the protagonist by perfectly mirroring the player's every move in Hot Pursuit. The idea of alternate reflections is key to figuring out how to obtain the crystal heart of this level. Crystal hearts are super hidden collectibles that are complicated to obtain and function as a proof of the player's wit and platforming skills, with the final bonus stage requiring a set amount of these for entry. They are generally inconsequential riddles or cheeky secret pathways, but the one in the old site is different for how it is introduced and contextualized, with the player easily finding it trapped behind walls after waking up and cooling down from the nightmare. And attached is a short little poem to set the mood.
An apparition, not of this world, but because of it, lurking out of frame. Awake! My heart is a fortress. In dreams, I am vulnerable.
This is primarily a vague hint of how to obtain the elusive crystal heart, revealing that you have to find it somewhere out of frame in the dream world. The proper solution is to exploit screen transition dash recharges mid-air right at the beginning of the level to reach a secret alcove. However, the poem equally functions to describe Madeline and what she stands for, reinforcing that theme of the alternate dream world. She's not of this world, she's rather a reflection of it, that's always been there in one sense or the other. The idea of the fortress is interesting in how it's doubly subverted in the old site. In the waking world, the place is but a fragment of its initial size and scope, with the dream world portraying it in a still decayed, albeit less demolished state. The place is a ruin regardless, though one clearly resembles a fortress more than the other. But the heart is still protected in its waking state, bringing a sort of irony in how the more complete fortress fails to fulfill its defensive purpose. On a grander scale, consider how we may function as fortresses in everyday life, with the waking and dreaming states suggesting the internal and external. While sleeping, Madeline is alone in her own world, relaxed, vulnerable. She later reveals that she's barely keeping up appearances, furthering the poetic parallel of the dilapidated fortress, and how she then must escape that fortress when it's literally intruded by herself. You ever had that feeling when you've been run dry, exhausted and exploited for years, chased by something, anything, until you get trapped in a corner like a wild animal, and something has to burst? But it's not the conditions, it's not the forces tying you down, it's you who breaks, leaving you forever altered, scarred. It's vindicating in the most humble sense to have Celeste capture this so perfectly with the old site chase sequence. How the portrayal of an anxiety panic attack borders on triggering trauma, and then leaving you in calm serenity, able to find a light in the darkness. Solace. But the experience still lingers. It taints you, humiliates. Through build-up, release, and wind-down, Chapter 2 of Celeste manages to capture a sliver of what a panic attack actually feels like. Not just within the moment, but equally what happens afterwards. And the game wants to make this so clear to you that it ignores the subtext and straight up announces by the conclusion what you've just experienced. This right here is the setup for the conflict of mental health within Celeste. The mountain has been defined. And it is only now that we've exposed this most vulnerable part that we're ready to start climbing for real. Celestial Resort is perhaps the one chapter that will seem the most like a throwaway detour when taken at relative face value. It may further the conflict between Madeline and Madeline by exploring how their boundaries differ, familiarize us a bit more with Theo before he becomes a major character, and reinforce the magic properties of Celeste Mountain with the present ghosts. All things that get further emphasis and development in subsequent levels, But the meat and potatoes here is the portrayal of Oshiro, the hotel manager, who's basically the least prominent character in the game apart from, like, Madeline's mom. On a casual playthrough, you'll visit the Celestial Resort, observe Oshiro being a pathetic wreck, and then forget about him completely until the post-credit scene. With context, however, Chapter 3 reveals itself as a continuation and escalation of the themes from the previous level. It's equally about parallels and a mirror reflection, but through a more sobering, revelatory light. It's actually kind of bold in how crass it is. Of course, Oshiro being a ghost on the journey primarily reflects lingering and stagnation. I mean, the guy is literally dead. He's not gonna go climb mountains anytime soon. But more so, he's an outside perspective on Madeline, because really, they're both the same, aren't they? Madeline practically confirms it in her own harsh way. That constant anxious inaction, talking to himself, with little regard for others. Perhaps Madeline isn't as obsessive as him and showcases stronger willpower, but the juxtaposition of Madeline's mother reminding her to breathe shortly before Madeline says the same to Oshiro is striking. The developers even confirmed that the dust creature's independent movement was meant to symbolize dealing with someone else's anxiety. If not a reality check on Madeline, Oshiro is at least a warning, a glimpse at what happens to the lost souls who got stuck without the resolve to move on. At a later point, Theo asks Madeline to describe depression so he can know what it feels like. In this sense, he is blind to Oshiro's struggles, only seeing the outwardly troubled behavior and misinterpreting it as creepy and hostile. Whether Madeline's belief that she can help Oshiro is plausible or not is secondary to the fact that she is able to understand him more than Theo can. Surely she must be able to see something of herself in him to make that attempt. Oshiro is a Japanese name, meaning Great Castle, which is an apt descriptor for him. Just like Madeline had her fortress in the old site, the directly succeeding Celestial Resort is Oshiro's fortress, which he has locked himself inside and become trapped within. He's an exemplary cautionary tale of lingering, with his obsessive double-checking and inaction, leaving his restless soul to cling on to a long-abandoned hotel business, way past his own death. However pointless it may initially seem, this meeting with Oshiro ultimately aids in Madeline's growth. After Madeline has openly lashed out at and berated Oshiro, sort of freely speaking her mind on pent-up frustrations from wasted time, he snaps and attacks Madeline in response. With this scene, we need to contextualize Madeline as inherently a part of Madeline, something she's directly responsible for and not externally removed from. Whether as a loss of patience or exposure of her inner thoughts, the takeaway is that Madeline fucked up big time with Oshiro. There is no pointing at your dark reflection as the culprit, just acceptance of the consequences of your actions as Oshiro acts out. The only way out is escape. The chapter leaves us with no satisfying conclusion, only an awkward parting and bad feelings. At the moment, the stay at the Celestial Resort may have been a major failure in one sense, but on a brighter note for Madeline's development, the experience has still moved her one step further along the way to self-improvement. As she states later after Madeline has apologized, it's in the past. She cannot afford to linger, because doing so will only hinder her. And that's probably the best takeaway from the chapter. While Madeline still cares about Oshiro and wishes him well, there is perhaps no need to linger on him, lest she wishes to in some way also become Oshiro and completely give up the ghost. As mentioned previously, Chapter 4, Golden Ridge, is a bit of an in-between chapter to pace out the story, as it's very light on actual narrative weight, instead focusing entirely on the platforming aspect. It was probably the right call to make for separating two pretty lengthy segments. It's only as a piece in a larger whole that the intent and meaning of the chapter becomes more apparent, primarily in how it is the middle point, but more importantly, the turning point. As you progress through the level, the wind thrashes in all kinds of directions, always being an obstacle in your way. It's a bit of poetic fun to implement the idea of swimming upstream into the game mechanics, but it works as both pacebreaker and a messenger for the general themes of struggle. The wind is constantly working against you, making progress slow and the jumps more difficult. You might even start feeling like if the wind would go away, things could be easier. Perhaps you'd be able to do this a lot quicker. And at about the point where you've had it with this Force 10 gale, the wind turns. It helps you. You've mastered nature, and now you're ready to take on the fight for real. Up until this point, every chapter has ended in some kind of defeat, always furthering the conditions of doubt for Madeline's resolve to shine through. This chapter ends in disaster as well, but marks the first time a firm hand guides Madeline through the storm, allowing her to catch a break and for once conclude on a smile. That's the Golden Ridge, not merely a mountainside cliff, but the moment this story turns around and starts to resolve itself. It's all in the contrast. When meeting hardships in the previous chapters, Madeline was on her own, with no one to help her get things straight. As the Golden Ridge concludes, she boards a gondola with Theo, a young, hip, righteous dude who's only made sporadic appearances by this point, to the extent that the player can actually completely ignore him up until a brief encounter in Chapter 3, which, by the way, yields slightly different dialogue if you do so. Neat. As they travel in the creaky old cable car, it suddenly stalls, with the control lever breaking off. Facing impending doom, Madeline falls into another panic attack. Only this time, Theo is there to help her through the experience. By teaching her a breathing exercise, the previously established anxiety issue is averted and de-escalated, with the gondola resuming operation shortly afterwards, saving the two from a grim fate. Continuing the portrayal of anxiety from Chapter 2, this segment uses that framework to alter the scene into one with a brighter outcome. The idea of balancing the feather follows along with common practices in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short, like square breathing. Inhale, hold, exhale, rest. This is likely something people suffering from generalized anxiety disorder may be familiar with from therapy. The idea is basically to control your own breathing, to focus on that alone and suppress the bodily symptoms of a panic attack. Of course, there are a lot of ways to treat and deal with anxiety. You'd probably be right in your concern when Theo doesn't just ask Madeline where she keeps her bottle of Atarax, but for simplicity's sake, the feather works for the narrative. The idea of the feather and how it is later implemented as a game mechanic for flight should rather be seen as something more widely applicable than the superiority of one specific treatment over the other. The feather is introduced through the initial interactive breathing exercise, yes, but it's more than that. It's a tool for overcoming your problems, a symbol for guidance, whatever that may be for you personally. Feathers are light and float freely in the air, like birds navigate through wind to fly. It's no wonder the concept is introduced in a level revolving around the wind, and how that wind will also turn to your benefit. By the end, Madeline is no longer struggling. She's flying. The tables have truly turned. I meant wind, fuck! It's the wind that's turned. Can we do a retake on that? What we mean to say with the turning of the wind is of course not that there is no more struggle, or that things would get any less complicated from here. Both from a game design and narrative perspective, that's not at all true. The levels keep getting harder, and the subject matter, especially in the Mirror Temple, reaches its darkest point. But the wind that's turned is how these conflicts get resolved. From here on out, there are no more sad endings, only triumph. Whatever hardships get in Madeline's way, she now has the tools to overcome every single one of them. The Mirror Temple may be the most oppressively grim part of the game, but Madeline's resolve is what helps her get through disaster on top, saving Theo and becoming a hero. Of course, she still has lots to learn and more defeats to suffer, but they don't hurt as much as they obstruct her progress, and that's important. You might say she overcomes this step through self-sacrifice by helping others, but that's also a fantastic start to learning to help yourself. In other words, she failed in helping Oshiro with himself, but could not allow herself to not save Theo from himself. That's the key difference. The Mirror Temple is the point where the magic properties of Celeste Mountain goes into full metaphysical metaphor mode, manifesting the inner world of the characters through the now constant idea of reflection. Up until this point, mirrors have had passing relevance to the story, literally as a vessel for Madeline to be set free upon the world, but also in more subtle terms, like the smartphone selfie reflecting a controlled self into the world. Like a front stage, backstage situation where we try to present our ideal self to the other. After all, no one looks good without a filter. Throughout the game, Madeline and Theo will take 3 selfies together, all reflecting their current states, with the final being the one Madeline suggests herself, showing a growing development to finally be able to face herself in the mirror. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Upon arrival with the gondola, Madeline and Theo steps out into an ancient structure, resembling nothing else they've encountered before. In excitement, Theo runs ahead, only to get lost along the way. And in pursuit, Madeline discovers he has been whisked away to the mirror world. Venturing further, she encounters a theater-scale magic mirror that pulls her into that alternate world, inhabited by hostile creatures. In the grand scheme of Celeste, this journey into the self is very much what the core of the game is about: confronting your own demons and coming out victorious. That's why it's so interesting how the Mirror Temple has no relationship to Madeline, as you might have first suspected. This is not her domain. She's as much of an outsider here as Madeline, which finally gives us more context as to Madeline's nature and relevance to Madeline herself. Whatever she finds in this world is a product of her, not of anything external. You could see it as the mirror creatures simply being a deeper version of Madeline, but that's probably not really it. Both of these spring from Madeline herself, and for them to have any distinct unique relevance without the story basically repeating itself, they need to be mutually exclusive. You may contextualize this as the inner voice versus the inner self. Madeline speaks to Madeline on a more direct conscious level, while the monsters are a dormant underlying part of Madeline. It's the difference between you telling yourself bad things and having inherent uncontrollable ideas and urges. For example, this relationship between the 3 parties could fit neatly into the psychoanalytical theory of the id, the ego, and the superego, forming a scale between the instinctively animalistic and the inner critical moral ideal, with the self in the middle acting as a mediator. And that's not to put too much stock in old dusty Freudian theory. I mean, they are basically just Castlevania Medusa heads. But on a more poetic level, the contrast and counterbalance is rather fitting. The point being, whatever is found in the Mirror Temple is not part of Madeline. It's probably completely alien to her. This level constitutes a polar opposite of the reflections seen in Old Sight, pulling from the same ideas but exploring a completely different aspect of Madeline. The monsters function as a sort of reflection of Madeline, taking her characteristics and skewing them. With hair-like tentacles that change between red and blue while dashing, the player is introduced to them through a small interactive segment where you navigate the creature around some obstacles in order to destroy Madeline. Mainly, this is a way to teach the players the boundaries and capabilities of this new external game mechanic. They're obstructed by magic force fields, destroy breakable walls, and will hunt the player. But more importantly, for this brief interactivity, we instinctively understand them to in some way be connected to Madeline. They're another form of reflection, equally true, but from another angle. And in comparison to the eyes merely staring at Theo, or the crystal trapping him, it's very peculiar how this inner reflection of Madeline is set out on hurting her. Like, this chapter is almost shockingly dark in how it reveals an inner urge in Madeline for self-harm, and you may take this in either the physical or psychological way. After all, there are many ways to do this that don't involve literal bodily harm, and you're free to imagine any form that feels befitting for your personal interpretation. But it is striking how Celeste, in its own subtle way, still dares to go there. And that is kind of phenomenal in conjunction with the resolution and message. Madeline's victory here is practically a rejection of those urges. It's a mastering of harmful impulses, and a definite landmark for her healing. If you reverse the track in the mirror that plays during this segment, you actually get a secret message.
Sometimes I don't really know what's going on anymore. I don't know who I am. I just look in the mirror and don't know who I'm looking at or who's looking at me. I think a lot about where my train of thought is going, and it's not always a good place, and that scares me. I don't like scaring myself.
This goes with the idea of self-harm and the fear many people have of it. If you have never experienced those thoughts, let me tell you, they're absolutely terrifying. It's like a loss of control where your rational thoughts bleed with a growing urge to destroy. Perhaps most familiar in the abyss, when you stand at the side of a cliff and something deep inside tells you to jump off. So just imagine that, but in regular everyday life situations. It's scary stuff, but sadly, a very real aspect of many people's lives. Chapter 5 of Celeste is an exploration of the inner self, a take on self-harm, but perhaps at its most obvious, a depiction of depression. It's the descent into darkness and hopelessness, a trek through the most oppressive inner reality. But it's also about help and guidance. Madeline does this to help Theo, and in a sense, that drive is what helps her. In this way they help each other, and it's a good way to contrast this chapter with the previous ones, to signify what was truly missing before. And it's only through overcoming this honest, naked exposure of the inner self that Madeline is truly able to face her own reflection and embrace herself. Reflection is truly an odd chapter in the general design structure of Celeste. While other levels feature a relatively straightforward platforming setup with optional strawberry challenges along the way, Reflection opens up with a huge character exposition scene, only to then turn completely and be a distractionless diverging pathway towards a lengthy boss confrontation. It's so narrative reliant that it borders on feeling completely out of place, but it works simply through never getting lost or distracted from what Celeste is ultimately all about. It's through the initial scene that we're given most of the information on Madeline and Theo that then informs our understanding of the characters. And while a lot of the stuff they talk about is either hinted at or basically assumed, if you just consider previous moments somewhat, it's a neat way of putting everything you need in the actual text. It's kind of the small, underappreciated balance that makes the thematic messaging of Celeste so universal. Sure, the scene of two young adults shooting the shit and trying to find a purpose in this world is intensively relatable in a contemporary commentary sense. But it's also one of many channels for putting the idea of mental health front and center, for everyone to really get it. Finding that balance between ambiguity and preachiness is really difficult if there is a certain signal you wish to get across for the people who really need it, without it all being too on the nose. Most people do understand Celeste as a narrative allegory for anxiety and depression, simply because it's unavoidable in the text, while still being broad enough for the specificity of the themes to be completely open for interpretation. They may seem like very rigid and narrow plot points, but they're simply the reaction to a cause that is largely unexplained in the game. Whatever that is for you to decide. Neither redundant or obtuse, the writing manages to balance the text completely for everyone to follow along. Equally in its exposition on Madeline, this scene fleshes out Theo after brief glimpses of his life in previous chapters. The main purpose of Theo is that of being a more light-hearted counterbalance to Madeline's often heavy outlook. He reflects a different form of trouble, that of aimlessness, unrest, and lack of purpose. There is certainly an interesting balance in Theo's embracing of modernity and Madeline's alienation from the norm. They are very much polar opposites, and as such, they represent two different types of people with very different problems. You could contrast it in many other ways, like the extrovert and the introvert, or the neurotypical and the neurodivergent. The basic idea, though, is that for whatever problems Madeline represents in the mountain allegory, Theo is the reverse of that, still having his own struggles to overcome. Just not the same ones. Several times throughout the game, Theo will even mention his sister Alex, who's supposedly very similar to Madeline, reinforcing a comfort that Madeline is not at all alone in feeling the way she does. There's certainly nuance to people and their problems. Actually, there's a surprising depth to Theo's character thanks to his complementary social media presence. Several times in the game, he mentions posting his pictures on the fictional application Instapics under the username of @Theo_stars. Of course, the real-life parallel would be Instagram, where observant and curious players could discover an account managed by the fictional character, which even kept being updated sometime after release of the game. Basically, if you ever get into a discussion about Celeste with someone and they start talking about stuff like Madeline's dad, that's because he occupies 5 pixels in the background of this one social media post. Look, he's right there! Although this is actually very significant to the lore, as it signifies the color changes Madeline's hair goes through while dashing is a representation of her immediate family, and actually, she can't really dash. It's just a symbol of her dying wish when falling off the bridge in the intro. She's actually dead, all along. In a coma. In purgatory. Prove it didn't happen. The segment concludes with Madeline believing herself to have found answers and new solutions to her problems, prompting a dream sequence introducing the previously established feather as a game mechanic for flying. Here, she confronts Madeline with the completely wrong lesson learned from their previous encounters, believing that she can ignore Madeline until she goes away, and that this would solve all of their problems, failing to understand that Madeline is inherently a part of Madeline and something she can never get away from. The way Celeste has the protagonist arrive at the completely wrong conclusion for its message is actually pretty darn neat, and another very underappreciated aspect for humanizing Madeline. This works doubly, not just for adding depth, but also as clarification on the narrative. Basically as a small nod that whatever conclusion you take, running away from your problems probably ain't it. It's a fatal mistake that results in the biggest defeat in the entire game, having Madeline fall down from the literal mountain she climbed to hit absolute rock bottom. But this is where the chapter begins. And as we've explained before, Celeste is a journey up the metaphysical mountain. As such, this seemingly massive failure is merely nothing but a small hiccup on the road for her. After a pep talk from Granny, Madeline gets an insight into Badeline's behavior and finally manages the last push to reach her own internal mountaintop through the power of friendship. The idea of reflections in media is a convenient poetic shorthand for self-reflection. The dark copy of the protagonist is commonly used to explore the boundaries of their identity, to truly understand what constitutes their core. This, in conjunction with the mirror, is one of the fundamental themes of Celeste, which finally reaches its conclusion in Chapter 6. The true inner revelation and acceptance is to not only fully understand Badeline's perspective, but forgiving her, understanding her relevance to the self, and finally, embracing her. Literally, but also metaphysically. Badeline's antagonism is not sprung from malice, it's rather fear and an exaggerated rationality bordering on misguided. Climbing a mountain is dangerous, difficult, and yields no true extrinsic reward. The doubt she expresses is that of concern. She is truly scared. It's the idea of the fortress all over again. Badeline wants to protect Madeline by locking her up where nothing and no one can hurt her. But this is not how Madeline needs to live. By showing Badeline courage and compassion, they can finally reunite and become whole again, like the changing wind turning from an obstacle to a benefit. And with that, Madeline has scaled the allegorical mountain. She has healed from her worries and become a more confident person, ready to take on the same old problems with a renewed outlook. In a sense, the story could probably end satisfyingly here, with Madeline realizing that this was what she needed to do all along. The literal mountain was only a distraction on the journey of overcoming herself. She does not truly need to climb it now. But for the sake of tying up loose ends and exhibiting how much she has learned, the game ends on a final level, taking her all the way to the top, breezing through all the places she struggled on so hard the first time through. For both the player and Madeline, it's a sense of perspective, and soon enough, through cooperation, this second chance is demonstrably so much more quick and convenient than if you'd play through the entire game again. The added extra dash and rapid succession of the stage rehashes is a very neat way of conveying the idea that Madeline and Badeline's unification not just makes the climb into a breeze. It puts all the previous struggle and effort into perspective as highly counterproductive. Perhaps Madeline would have made it had she not fallen down, but no way would the reward have been the same. As a conclusion, the Summit chapter teaches us what happens when we stop fighting ourselves and learn to accept and deal with our shortcomings. It's a triumphant indulgence. But after all we've been through, don't we deserve a refreshing change of pace? And that concludes Celeste. As the power team reaches the peak, they pause and take in the sunset before going back home together, where Madeline bakes a strawberry pie for all her dearest friends. But Celeste is funny in that way. While the mountain has been scaled in both senses of the term, and the view broadens, another mountain is revealed on the horizon, inclining us towards the strive for something more. What if we collected more strawberries to make an even better pie? Perhaps we should check out the B-side stages. And how do you really find all those crystal hearts? The credits have rolled, but the story continues, picking up 1 year later where Madeline returns to the mountain to explore a newly discovered cave. a place switching on a whim from melting hot to freezing cold, presenting a challenge far greater than any you've faced before. The struggle goes on. You just learn to deal with it in another way, to control your switching moods and never falling back down again. Madeline ventures into the root of her mountain, goes to the bottom of all it stands for, and at its true core, she finally finds something dear and long lost to her. Inner peace. Finally, concluding on a last note where Madeline is completely back in her groove. But wait, there's more! A year and a half later, the developers released an extra super long, obnoxiously difficult stage where Granny dies and Madeline goes on an obsessive quest to find her somewhere in her metaphysical dream reality, giving context to how old problems may give way to new ones, and putting a befitting spin on the idea that getting over loss is perhaps the hardest struggle of all. But after overcoming the impossible, by swallowing your pride and activating assist mode, you persevere. Oh geez, that looks really hard. Good thing we don't need to do that. What are you even supposed to do here? At the end of this most intense challenge of all, Madeline gets some Inception closure with Granny and wakes up from a long dream. With this, she reconnects with her old friend Theo after having gone off the radar for a while, talking about the difficulty in parting with old loved ones like Granny or Theo's grandfather, and finding solace in how they could still get to mutually experience the mountain and share that even past their lifetimes. Finally, concluding Celeste on a heartfelt moment of emotional parting. But wait! There's even more! Did you know there are seasides? Oh, that's gonna be a lot of fun. Don't forget to play the Pico 8 prototype. Did you know that there is a hidden developer room? Well, there it is. Get those achievements too. The 1-up challenge is really tricky. Not to forget the golden strawberries, rewarded for beating a level without dying. But you've probably been working towards that already, considering the game tracks the stats of your most ideal level runs. Hey, why not try out the variety mode? You can play the game in invisibility mode. With tripping. Haha, good luck with that one. Celeste is a game with a framed core narrative. But it's also one with a very clear meta-narrative surrounding the idea of the struggle and a constant strive for more, employing the way video games can be challenging to extend the experience as long as the player wishes to stretch it. You may see the credits roll, but the game never truly ends. If you keep following its breadcrumbs and persevere until you've reached the absolute limit of the game's challenges, you'll probably be a top-ranking speedrunner. And that doesn't even take into account how alternate paths may revolve around creating and enjoying fan content, stalking one of the game's characters on Instagram, playing as Madeline in that other game, Tower something, putting all of the merch on Fangamer in your shopping cart for fun just to see how much it would cost and accidentally clicking on the buy button. Whoops! Or making a super long video essay on YouTube, oh fuck! As Granny says in one of the many concluding scenes, we get kinda attached to the struggle. But perhaps this isn't just about that. It's probably something more. A growing sentimentality and familiarity with the characters and their fates. It's easy to grow attached to these goofy goobers and never really letting go. And in an ironic twist on Undertale's arguably harsh philosophy on letting go, Celeste goes the completely opposite route and allows you to hold on, to remain dependent on it. Because Celeste is a game about learning to overcome your own struggles, and for that, everyone needs to take their own time. Your journey isn't gonna be over when Madeline's is. Fact is, that's possibly the initial push needed to even get you started. Celeste understands its role in this sense and tells you that it is okay. You're allowed to love and obsess over it. There will always be something more you can come back to, some new lesson to be learned, or simply as solace in a hostile world. This is probably why so many people play the game and never truly let go. It sticks in your mind and invites you to come back again and again. It's actually kind of wonderful in a very odd way. This punishingly hard platform game kinda just gets into your soul, man. It's got too much heart for you to ever be able to completely shake it off. And it's all the better for it. Celeste is evidently a game cram-packed with content and opportunities for all kinds of readings, that it may feel daunting to really find your way back to its core after the fact. It's easy to get lost in the minute details and ponder if the B-sides are canon or not, in more ways than just the meta text, or get hung up on the implications of negative psychic energy, or whatever. Perhaps the most helpful counterbalance to reading Celeste is how its proof of concept prototype is included in the package, putting it front and center for people to be aware of it and what it conveys in contrast to the completed game. The development of Celeste went from a very bare bones origin, with successive layers added as time went on. The Pico 8 incarnation teaches us first and foremost that the mountain allegory may not initially have been explicit, but that it forms the core basis of everything the game would later become. Starting out with the working title Everest, from the idea of a vertical platformer contextualized as a mountain climb, the name quickly changed to Celeste, to add a local flair inspired by the actual very real Mount Celeste in Canada. Celeste actually has a couple of those, perhaps the cutest one being how the flag for English in the language option screen is the Canadian one. You know, it's not wrong. The Pico 8 title is a super simple sketch on the idea of using mid-air dashes to navigate peril, while constantly ascending with every screen. It's all very familiar. You've got the snow, the strawberries, the changing hair color, subsequent extra dash, and the elusive peak. All things that would later reappear in the finished game, but perhaps not everything that would come to define it. However, the most interesting old relic is the memorial dedicated to those who perished on the climb. Considering it remained intact all the way from point A to B, we feel it's fair to argue that it always presented some of Celeste's fundamental ideas. The struggle, peril, and difficulty, the resolve to overcome. With context, yes, the Pico 8 game actually has all the ingredients to be read as a mountain allegory, but perhaps it wasn't really intentional by that point. Intent comes later, when you can match and connect the jigsaw pieces. Thanks to this prototype and development stream, we know a lot about how Celeste grew and came to be. The levels were designed in chronological order, with the fine-tuning being handled afterwards. As stated, stages were formed around general feelings, and only after that, a narrative evolved around them, giving credence to the idea of Celeste as an allegory. The foundation is the expressive, the story not an afterthought as much as a way to contextualize emotion within a conventional narrative. They almost even went too far in including lore dumps and distracting narrative fluff, but found restraint and realized that this was not at all what the game needed. And it is vindicating to see them harbor the same stance that we do, in that the game should be able to be read in all kinds of deeply personal ways. And as such, there's little individual importance to the minute details. Rather, they're there for the player to potentially latch onto.
What's who green hair? I don't know what you're talking about with green hair. Oh, who's in the portrait with green hair? Yeah, I don't know, it's ambiguous.
While not contradicting each other, little tidbits like X are there for nuance. You see, it's her ex on the phone. But what that entails is up to you. If you need, you can see this as the ignition for the game being a breakup story about learning to love yourself again. And equally, you may see Madeline as a recovering alcoholic, suffering withdrawal, or perhaps someone on a path of personal redemption fighting their past sins. But the gist is that you overcome the mountain to heal. What the mountain represents is deeply personal. In fact, while the most common shorthand interpretation is that of Madeline suffering from general chronic depression and anxiety disorder, with ambiguity equaling no apparent cause at all, the narrative around learning to love yourself resonated deeply with the trans community. Even before the farewell update added the ending scene with the pride flags, which are super blatant if you zoom in really close on them, there were still breadcrumbs in the narrative that players could latch onto for a trans reading. Like the fragile self-image evident from Madeline being reluctant to take a picture of herself, excused as her not being photogenic, or asking why Madeline would look so creepy on their first encounter, with the response being a familiar, tired annoyance. Also consider the large advertisement posters in the Forsaken City that present unattainable ideals as obvious gender roles. For a closeted trans woman, the conflict of the commanding man up versus the doubtful are you beach ready reflects a very real part in how society will encourage or gatekeep individuals from choosing their own path. In fact, the whole concept of the Mirror Temple gains an extra dimension when you consider the grotesque monsters to be a visual representation of the stranger Madeline sees in the mirror. What we mean to say is that through Celeste as an allegory, players already had the fuel to interpret the game as a trans narrative, way before it suddenly got really important to clarify how prescription estradiol pills are packaged in Canada. Some critique was aimed towards the game for having its supposed trans narrative be so subtle and non-consequential that it basically became non-existent. But that's a bit too disingenuous for the intended whiff of Celeste's thematic conveyance. It's about as blatant or non-explicit as any other reading. This all came to a head in November 2020 when director Maddie Forson wrote a blog post about the whole ambiguity situation, confirming that Madeline is in fact canonically trans. The background and reasoning behind it being vague within the text is clarified in how these are concepts integrally connected to deeply personal feelings on Maddie's own gender identity. Basically, it was a work in progress for them, having gone through different stages from initial release through the Farewell DLC and to today. It's not exactly a cryptic connection that Madeline probably has a lot of connections to Maddie Forson. They practically share the same name, and a lot of the emotional aspects in the game surely came from somewhere. And you know, the idea of Madeline as an offer self-insert also rationalizes the trans narrative in Celeste as a process of coming out. With this context, it's a bit too complicated for the developers to just have revised the game to retroactively make Madeline, to say, more trans. Trying to find some correct black and white response and resolution from an authorial perspective feels futile. Our takeaway is that the character of Madeline is expanded through addition rather than revision, which is not just controlled by the author, but also reflects their process. Considering the minimal changes that have been made to the base game since release, we're confident in our interpretation that Celeste is in many forms a time capsule of what it was and where its creators were, there and then. In that way, it's probably a bit unfair to read the vague hints present back in 2018 as willful neglect, and not as part of personal reflection. At the end of the day though, if you read Madeline's struggles as a trans narrative, then it is a trans narrative. And if not, well, her being trans shouldn't really affect or detract from your interpretation of whatever is happening on this cool mountain. Because it really doesn't. The idea that Madeline would be less relatable to cis people because she's trans is ridiculous, and about as relevant as the idea that you need to suffer from anxiety to fully get the game. Or heck, that boys aren't allowed to play it because you play as a girl. Maddie Forson comments on it all in a very neat way, saying that this narrative humanizes trans people and displays how their internal emotional worlds may not at all be that different from a cis person's. After all, there is no prohibition for wearing beautiful gay socks. Now, you may express some concern on this idea of canonical confirmation on ambiguous aspects of the text, that this narrows down the intention and creates an expectation for Celeste to still have a set correct answer for what it's all about. But in truth, who Madeline is doesn't detract from the mountain allegory. Her vague origins, the very real consequences and constant resolve to always come out on top, are still intact, and the way the game presents all of this is still wide open for a number of personal connections to be made both now and in the future. It's a timeless story in that way, iterating from countless predecessors, and no doubt set on a path to inspire many after it. To some extent, the most common interpretation, pulling the most from emphasis in the text, is the one about anxiety and depression, with a broader scope on mental health in general. And though it may seem like that perspective is so dominant to the degree that any other reading feels like baseless overanalysis in comparison, if you personally get something out of it, that's perfectly valid. If Celeste is primarily meant to be about mental health, then fine, it's perhaps the most obvious route, and probably also the one we agree with the most. But know that the way the game is written never truly demands this conclusion. But taken as a game about mental health, it's probably the absolute best of its class. Although, admittedly, that's a very small one. As is, it's pretty telling how impactful the story was to many people suffering from all kinds of psychological problems. A running internal joke is about how Celeste basically outs everyone suffering from generalized anxiety disorder based on their reaction on it. But isn't that also a good thing? A lot of people have found the confidence to open up and talk about their own feelings when discussing the themes of Celeste. And what's fascinating is how everyone seems to resonate with very different scenes. From that perspective, it feels wrong to argue about a definitive right or wrong of what Celeste should be. Because despite it all being highly scripted and fairly straightforward in its conveyance, every player seems to connect with it differently. As things stand, we have talked about this game in full excess, using the keys we feel to be the most agreeable to make a generalized reading. Our mission is not to present all of this and then connect the dots to one definitive conclusion, closest to some elusive objective truth. We have merely attempted to create the most complete compendium to an evidently very open-ended game, presenting its content and messages in further clarity for you to inform your own reading. We're not at all standing above the creators here. The solution is, and always was, in your hands. There is always another mountain, and whether you find that within or outside of Celeste, that's up to you. Well, everything is up to you really, but if you feel just like Madeline, like everything is going wrong, like you can't get out of your own head, like you are your own worst enemy, then take what you need from Celeste and use that to carve your own path, step by step, up your very own mountain, towards your own happiness and ambitions. You can do this. Thank you for watching this very long video all the way to the end. We worked very hard on it, so we hope you liked it. It was made possible by our lovely patrons, and we would of course like to thank them very much. And they are Andrew Jones, Anonymous, Lafayette, Ben Clark, Bibi the Bitch, Cult of Diana, Ember, Emrasa, Huang Wu, Joel Nilsson, Luke, Mattias Graman, Meow Mix 64, Nate Kiernan, Nish Sweat, Sweet Pink, Tommy Håkansson, Saifi, Abigail Nail, Andreas, Aaron Rain, Basklin, Billy Moran, Botch Frivarg, Charles Goldhaber, Chloe, Eli Bergmas, Flufquist, Gage McColgan, Jerry Olsson, Mar B, Mikael Ottens, Nerdsync, Tobias Mattsson, Vexelbun, and Chimeras, Anders Eklöf, Andreas Argulander, Bald Space Marine 33. Ben personally approves this message. Biopanda, Baba Kenzie, Casey Explosion, David J. Bradley, Emil Ulin, Flame Flamberge, Florian David, Frankie Teardrop, Goblin, Gothic Garfield, Gustav Granlund, I Am a Dumb Baby, Isaac Abrahamsson, Jelly God, Karen Scholz, Lady Goggles, Losty, Magnus, Malang Rubin, Miko, Morgan, Oscar Funes Galindo, Raivokas Magma, Riley Rose, Ro, Silly Rookie, Starfighter, TB Skyen, Tegan Bread, Trash Baby, Trucy, Tough Emily, Victoria Archel Solis, Whiskey Dono, and Salty Boy.